Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time talking episode 11 of Legends of Tomorrow called The Magnificent Eight. And after some rather heavy stuff the last few episodes, this episode is definitely a little bit lighter, a little bit more fun. And I enjoyed it quite a bit. So let's kind of get right into it. Of course, the name of the episode is a nod to The Magnificent Seven, which is, of course, a remake of Akira Kurosawa's classic, um, The Seven Samurai. Uh, it's kind of hard to mess up a nice little homage to Akira Kurosawa. I haven't actually seen The Seven Samurai, but I've seen, was it Rashomon and Hidden Fortress, and those are both really good movies. Anywho, let's just kind of get right into these things. And this episode, it takes the team to the Old West, which of course in American comic books is one of the staple time travel destinations, simply because it's an extremely interesting and colorful period in American history. And of course in American culture, cowboys do tend to be treated with a great deal of reverence. Yeah, kind of before superheroes really got to be a thing, cowboys were kind of filled that void. I mean, up until probably like the 19 later part of the 1960s, the 1970s, you could basically count on there being a whole slew of new Western shows on TV the same way now as it is that every new TV season you can count on there being doctor shows, cop shows, and lawyer shows. That idea, with the occasional exception, such as Deadwood, has more or less faded. So now, yeah, and tastes in society change, I suppose. But anyway, let's just kind of get right into things. Now, Ray, of course, is absolutely thrilled to be back in the Old West, and is totally down for, hey, let's go do the Western thing and clean up the town and stop the bad guys, save the town, all this other stuff. Because and this makes sense, as Ray is the most straight up traditionally heroic member of the group, and of course Ray is also a very compassionate person. I mean, it's that compassionate side of his personality is what allowed him to, during the famous storyline, the Blackest Night, gain the powers of one of the Indigo tribe, basically the Indigo Lanterns. And if you're not familiar with them, they're kind of, long story short, they're kind of like Green Lanterns, except their power comes from their ability to feel compassion. So Ray Palmer, extremely, extremely compassionate person, and we do see that here on display. And him grabbing the whole John Wayne mantle. I mean, that's basically kind of what Marty McFly did in Back to the Future, except he used Clint Eastwood. And I mean, again, it really just goes through every ridiculous Old West cliche with, Ray is like, hey, I'm going to help you, Sheriff, take down the bad guys. And of course, immediately getting dopped with the, okay, you can be the sheriff, I'm out of here. But again, as kind of ridiculous as the whole situation is, it's totally in keeping with Ray as a character to do all of those things. And again, this is meant to be a fun episode, so, I can't blame the show for just running with it on that front. Let's see, not a huge amount to say about Sarah this episode. I did like that scene with her in Heatwave where there's kind of obvious where she's sort of like, you've obviously changed. And he goes, oh, is it good or bad? She says, I can't tell yet. You know, there is some more than a few similarities between those two on that levels. I mean, in a lot of ways, Snart and Mick are the two guys on the ship who really are the most on Sarah's level. They're all three people who've been down in the dirty side of life for a really, really long time, and are each in their own way trying to become something better. Uh, but watching Sarah get into that drinking contest with Mick, that was pretty hilarious. It reminded me of a friend of mine from college. He went and studied for a year in Australia, and one time he and I were talking about, like, well, hey, what was it like down in Australia? And he said, and he had a pretty good time down there. But he did say that one thing that was really hilarious was to watch the other American guys down there routinely get drunk under the table by their Australian girlfriends. So when I saw that scene, that story kind of leapt back to my mind. Yes, grammar. Let's see. So we mentioned Snart, so let's briefly talk about him. This episode, he kills someone, and while Stein is like, "Oh my God, you killed someone," nobody says like, "Oh, we're sure this guy wasn't important to the timeline, right?" Nobody ever says that. Which, yeah, guys, that would seem to be pretty important. But again, then they have this big superhero battle in the middle of an Old West town in front of God only knows how many witnesses, and they're like, nobody will ever believe anything these people say anyway, so let's not worry about it. So we don't have to worry about it. Okay. I'm going to let that one roll, because we've seen that exact same sort of situation in many uh, time travel stories before. And also, apparently, according to the Superman versus Batman, Batman can kill people and it's totally okay. Well, okay. Movie Batman has been killing people since like 1989, so I suppose I shouldn't. You know what? Screw that Superman Batman movie. I don't want to talk about it. Okay, but I definitely did like that scene with Stein sort of talking about how, yeah, my dad was kind of a sleazebag gambler dude, and ultimately I decided to go down a different path. Again, this kind of mirrors the conversation that Ray had with Snart earlier in this season, where he said, like, Snart, in a different life, you could have been an engineer. And once again, Snart is presented with somebody who, in some ways, is actually very similar to him, but who went down a different path and became a better person than he is. So you have to wonder if, in the back of his mind, he can't be wondering, maybe I could have been a better person if I'd made some different choices. Now, Snart is not exactly dissatisfied with who he is as a person, but still. Let me put it this way. One of my favorite comic book series from the 1990s was this Kurt Busiek and Mark Bagley's run on a series called Thunderbolts. And it was basically supervillains dress up as superheroes in order to sort of start formulate as a first step in formulating a plan to take over the world. But as they kind of go around pretending to be heroes, some of the characters sort of like, you know what? Being a hero is kind of cool. I feel good about helping people. I like that people look at me with respect. I like that I feel as if what I do really matters. I'm a part of something better. I'm not just going for cheap small gains for myself. And ultimately, this leads to some very interesting stuff. So you kind of have to wonder if maybe a little bit of that isn't eventually going to start rubbing off on Snart. Now, I don't think we've seen very much of that so far in the show, and I don't think we're going to see him kind of having those thoughts anytime soon, but I see it as a kind of a possible place where he could go as a character, especially seeing as how he's genuinely started to connect with more people besides Heatwave and start to care about them, even though he is extraordinarily reluctant to admit it. So we'll have to see. Nothing really huge to say about Jax this episode. I know some people have kind of pointed out, like, hey, this is the Old West. Shouldn't people have made a little bit of a bigger deal about, some minorities strolling into town? Well, no doubt about it. There was plenty of racism in the Old West. But one also has to keep in mind that a lot of black people, a lot of Hispanic people kind of went out west because out there were different types of opportunities. I mean, it was a more dangerous, more untamed place, and people sort of had to say at times, okay, look, I don't care who or what you are. If you can help me get through today, then I'm willing to at least tolerate you. Now, again, the Old West was no bastion of toleration, but the whole situation on the ground was a lot more complicated than we tend to think. I mean, after all, this show is set in 1870, only 5 years after the official end of slavery. Well, slavery nationwide. Do keep in mind that there were places in America, such as my home state of Indiana, which banned slavery in 1820. So, slavery was illegal in Indiana for 45 years before it was legal nationwide. Incidentally, the U.S. and Great Britain also ended the international slave trade at the same time, which I believe was in 1809. So again, history is a lot more complicated if on the ground than just the casual glance that people tend to give it. But anyway, um, let's see. Going back though to moving on to Kendra. Now here we get some really interesting stuff. And also, once again, it was nice to see her and Sarah being pals. That's really nice. I do like those two together. They bounce off each other well. So Kendra bumps into the woman in the bar, and this turns out to be one of her past incarnations. Now, if you're kind of familiar with DC's Western characters, it's very quick. It's very easy to figure out who she is. The lady whose name is never mentioned in the show mentions that she was in love with a guy named Hannibal Hawks. Well, basic knowledge of DC Western lore is that that guy was Nighthawk. So Nighthawk's lover was a woman named Kate Masner, who went by the name of Cinnamon. I think she might have also sometimes been called Miss Cinnamon or something. Now, granted, if that's the case, I can kind of understand why they didn't say, like, she didn't have this lady be referred to as Cinnamon, because that would have been an extremely unfitting name. A little bit odd that they didn't mention so much as say, like, oh, by the way, my name, you can call me Kate or something like that. But, eh, but yeah, it is established in the comics that Nighthawk and Cinnamon were one of Khufu and Shara's past incarnations. In fact, one of the things they did in DC was when they kind of introduced this whole, born and fall in love and then they die terribly together. They took a lot of couples from various past periods of history in the DC universe, who and made them past incarnations of these two characters. There were, Cinnamon and Nighthawk. There were at least two characters from medieval England who were also revealed to have been past incarnations of these two. I don't think it was Shining Knight. Can't remember. I honestly can't remember. I've read that story where they did all of that once, and that was when the story came out originally. As it's been several years, but it's still a really cool story. Jeff Johns did some awesome stuff with all that Hawkman and Hawkgirl thing. Okay, but basically, and I'm just gonna call her Cinnamon, just for the fun of it. Basically says like, look, with anybody but Hannibal slash Carter, it never worked. And she even says, like, look, after he died, I loved another man, and I loved him genuinely and truly, but it still ended terribly. And of course, this is really relevant to Kendra because she's in this relationship with Ray. I mean, she's really very adamant about it. She says, like, look, I've pretty sure my other incarnations tried to have relationships after their version of Carter died, and it didn't work out, but none of them had ever met you, which is both very beautiful and very optimistic. But here she's got it dropped in her face like, yeah, here it is, proof in front of my eyes that trying to move on and love someone besides Carter is almost certainly just going to end in terrible disaster. So, that's quite the monkey wrench. Let's see, what else do we have to say? Yeah, nothing really particular to say about Heatwave, so I suppose that brings us to Rip Hunter and, of course, Jonah Hex. So, Jonah Hex, probably the most iconic of DC's Western characters. Here on the show, they sort of toned down his facial disfigurement. There's actually a really famous Jonah Hex story called A Face Full of Violence, which, of course, is a nod to the famous film A Fistful of Dollars, a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, if remember correctly, which I've seen part of, but I didn't get the chance to finish. But what I did see was good. I mean, Akira Kurosawa is an extremely revered director for very good reasons. Um, but yeah, as I said, it was called A Face Full of Violence, which is really an absolutely great way to describe Jonah Hex. Now, here on the show, he's a little bit more straight up heroic person. He's just kind of cranky and surly. In the comics, he's a little bit more of an anti-hero, not to mention being rather blatantly based on Clint Eastwood's character from The Outlaw Josie Wales, which if you're not familiar with, is kind of one of the basically one of the most iconic cowboy movies of the entire 19. Yeah, pretty sure it was the 1960s. I think that came out like 1965 or something like that. But anyway, very very famous cowboy movie, and Jonah Hex is pretty heavily based on Clint Eastwood's character from that movie. Um, But one thing that was very consistent about Hex is that he was this enormous weirdness magnet. Like, really strange, crazy stuff tended to happen to him. You know, if any of the DC heroes end up time traveling back to the Old West, it's pretty much guaranteed that he's going to meet them. Um, Now, the idea of Rip and Jonah becoming good friends, well, I can't help but think it's not a coincidence that Jonah Hex actually befriended Booster Gold when Booster went on a time traveling adventure, and despite them being wildly different people, the two of them ended up becoming pretty good friends. And if you're familiar with the connections between Rip Hunter and Booster Gold, yeah. But you know, and then of course there's also a famous series. I think it was from like the 1980s about Jonah Hex, where he actually got pulled into the future from the Old West and ended up in this Mad Max sort of time period, and he sort of got a motorcycle and started riding around in post-apocalypse America. I think it was even called Hex. I mean, like I said, Jonah Hex is a guy who just tends to have really weird science fiction, supernatural stuff happen to him. Um, Another great Jonah Hex stories is Jonah Hex Riders of the Worm and such, which I've read, and yeah, that's a good story, albeit very, very weird. So Jonah Hex taking a look at the one look at our crew and just basically immediately sussing out that they're time travelers did not surprise me in the least. In fact, the whole time that Jonah Hex is surprised by anything that he sees during all of this is when Stein and Jack sort of merge together into Firestorm, and then hilariously he crosses himself, which yeah, Jonah Hex is not a religious man. Let's put it that way. But that made me laugh, so I'm willing to let that slide. But you know, well, I haven't seen that Jonah Hex, the movie that came out a couple of years back, but this, as I understand it, is a very nice interpretation of Jonah Hex. I mean, again, his face is a little less messed up. He's a little bit more heroic, but you know, okay, I can let that slide. Um, Speaking of which, there were some nice other, besides, you know, Nighthawk and Cinnamon, there were also some nice nods to the comics. The character of Quentin Turnbull is mentioned, who is basically one of Hex's major enemies in the comics. If you pay really close attention, and I haven't seen anybody else online mention this, I guess I just happen to be looking at the right spot. You'll see on the background one of the signs says Cubert's Barber Shop. Well, Joe, Adam, and Andy Kubert are a family of comic book artists, father and two sons. Yeah, Joe is the father, who've basically been working as artists for Marvel and DC since the 1960s. Um, so that had to have been a little bit of a nod to homage to those guys, and rightly so. They're all three of them are extremely talented artists who've drawn a lot of really really great stuff. So let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in terms of like nods to the comics that I can think of, but no. Um, so, oh yeah, Rip. Now here is where again we learned some really interesting stuff about him, like the whole thing, like he went back to the old west, and they once again bring up that somewhat ridiculous idea that if you stay in a time period too long, you'll start to sort of forget who you are and feel like this is where you belong. And you know this happening to him and the old west. Well, it sort of shows that maybe in the past Rip was more like Ray, a much more idealistic person. Just recently happened to see a quote from the late great George Carlin, who said that inside of every cynic is a disappointed optimist. If you don't know who George Carlin is, he was a really famous comedian who died several years back, who was known for one his rather cynical attitude, but he was also known for just being hilarious, but having an absolutely amazing ability to just sort of cut through the bullshit and really point out what was going on with society and with people. Very, very smart, very insightful, and very funny, man. It really was a terrible shame when he passed on. But let's see here. Yeah, going back to Rip. It is easy to see that after all of these things that have happened to him, that he might have once been a more idealistic person, that somebody who really wanted to go out there and do these things that would help people. I mean, his whole shtick is, look, we're time masters and all, but the idea that it's humanity's destiny to be crushed under Vandal Savage's boot just because that's how time played out, no, that's wrong. That we can't let this be the destiny of the human race. We have to intervene for the good of the human species and of course the time masters are like, look, man, what is. So despite his more jaded attitude now, there is still that within him to a degree. And it's extremely interesting. I love how they point this out. It's like, wait a minute. You were friends with Jonah Hex. You named your son Jonas. Did you name your son after Jonah Hex? Now that's interesting. And of course, now we're in a position that the show's already, if I remember correctly, been renewed for another season. So if they want to bring Jonah Hex back again, well, people are familiar with him and know that he has connections to Rip Hunter, so it wouldn't be that hard. And of course, it's hard to also not imagine that maybe they're going to mix up the lineup of characters that they use on the show. I know a lot of people have been talking about how awesome it would be if they brought John Constantine on as a member of the show next season. Sort of that way they can kind of maybe mess around with magic, which would be really cool. People have also said it'd be really great if maybe this would be a way to use Vixen full time live action. And now here we've got another possibility of somebody we could bring on full time, Jonah Hex. I mean, time traveling cowboy? Woohoo! And again, it's established in comics that Jonah Hex has traveled in time before. And again, got connections to Booster Gold. Ooh. I mean, I don't really want to lose anybody from this show, but if you start thinking about like all the potential people they could have swap into the team next year, it gets extremely interesting. Anyway, I've been talking for over 20 minutes about this episode, so I think I will call it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. Of course, you can join me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi, and you can also join me on Tumblr at Jedi Reviewer. Until next time, take care and have a good one.